Today we have a very exciting guest and friend, Giancarlo Casale from Italy, joining us. As you know,
Hello,
in this program, great to have you, Giancarlo. As you know, in this program, we are talking about some big major issues in the Ottoman Empire through human history, human stories, and Giancarlo is one of the great storytellers, as you are going to see shortly. While we are talking about human stories and individual stories, we are also trying to remember from our previous program, we are also trying to tie those stories to some of the greater human experience. Giancarlo is currently chair of early modern Mediterranean history at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy, and he is also a permanent member of the history faculty at the University of Minnesota. He is teaching a wide variety of courses on Ottoman history, world history, Mediterranean history. He is, in that regard, truly a world historian. He is teaching us the transcultural encounters in this global history, since we historians are cherishing interconnectedness in historical matters. And again, Giancarlo is teaching those subjects to us. And he is perhaps one of the few, if not the only person, who uses Ottoman and Portuguese sources at the same time. And he is also one of the few scholars who have been expanding our horizon about the Ottoman contribution to global history and also Ottoman contribution to the age of explorations. As we all know, or commonly assume, Ottoman Empire is similar to many other early modern European or early modern world history, was a land-based empire, but Giancarlo's studies showed us that no, it was more than that. So shortly, we are going to talk about his findings, his takes on Ottoman Empire and its naval power and its maritime expeditions. But before that, I would like to, know him a bit more. And toward that end, I would like to ask him about his story. I know that Giancarlo in his studies also pay very much good attention to stories and importance of stories. And we all know that, stories are the ones which are connecting humans, not only in our time, but in the entire, throughout the history. So given the importance of the story and storytelling for us, I just want to ask about his story. Giancarlo, again, a friend from my Harvard years, God knows how many years we have been knowing each other and talking about these issues. I just want to, again, hear his story again as to how he developed an interest into this subject.
Well, thank you very much, Cengiz, for this invitation. And as you said, we are old friends, but we haven't seen each other for a long time. So this is a wonderful chance to reconnect. And I've also never really been to Houston before. So it's a great pleasure to visit your fine city.
Virtually,
only
yes.
Virtually. My story is completely serendipitous in the sense that before I started graduate school, I didn't have any background in Ottoman history at all. And to be honest, I didn't even really understand what it meant to apply to graduate school. I thought it was just a kind of a version of applying to undergraduate, but bigger. And I didn't have a very clear project that I defined, and I applied to a bunch of places while I was actually working odd jobs. It just so happened that our mutual advisor, Jamal Kafadar, saw my application, and at that time he was expecting to go to Italy for a research project about Gem Sultan. I don't know if that's somebody that you will ever talk about in your future episodes, but I think he took an interest in my profile because I knew Italian. I have a very Italian name and my family's Italian, but I grew up in the United States. But he was interested in somebody who knew Italian to help him with his research. And so he contacted my mother, because at that time there was no cell phone, there was no email address. I had given my mother's phone as a contact. So he called my mother and basically said, would your son be interested in changing his application to the program in Ottoman history, Middle Eastern studies? And if he does that, there's a possibility of a scholarship. And long story short, I ended up coming and starting the program with you, Cengiz, without even really knowing anything at all about Ottoman history or what it would mean to study it. So it was a very long road from there, I would say. And
there you are. You are a now world-renowned, world historian, and for that I really congratulate you.
And I have to say, the world history angle is totally a reflection of that, in the sense that I think most people who come to our field already have a very strong background, or they have a very strong connection with the region, or they are very they have a very clear understanding of the political implications of doing Ottoman history in Turkey, for example. But that wasn't my case at all. So I had to find some way to try to make it relevant to the things that I was more familiar with. So a world history approach was sort of natural for me.
And maritime history, of course, would be a perfect fit to your goals and aspirations, and also, ultimate success in that. Let's just now then start talking about some of the basics. We are going to be talking about, sailors and captives and concubines as a corollary to it in today's conversation. I am going to ask you, how would you define, Ottoman sailors? I mean, who are they? Who were those people? How did they become a sailor? What was so attractive about being a sailor? Was there a good path to success, or it is something we always imagine that the only captives were there? But before that, Giancarlo, I forgot to mention one other thing. I mean, from our audience, if you have any question, please write your questions in your Q&A box, and at the end we are going to allocate some time to talking or entertaining with your questions. And please make sure that your questions are short and readable in 10 seconds. Other than that, just let's just enjoy Giancarlo talking about his own definitions of sailors and their experience in the Ottoman Empire.
Well, there was a famous historian of the British Navy who said that if you compared a British ship from the early modern period with a prison, you would probably find that the prison had better accommodations, better food, and a tolerably better quality of companions, which gives you an idea of what most of the time it was like to be on a ship in the early modern period. This is not a pleasant place to spend your time. I think today a lot of people, they think of a ship and they have a very romantic kind of a notion of an aristocratic experience on a yacht, traveling from one Southeast Asian paradise to another. That is not the reality of life on a 16th or 17th century Ottoman ship, that's for sure. So there were sort of different paths to becoming a sailor, but many of them involved not somebody voluntarily choosing to spend their life on board of a ship. So there were people who were convicts, who actually were sentenced to serve, especially on galleys. Galleys are the most unpleasant kind of ship to be on because they're powered by people. So people have to actually be sitting there and rowing in the...
How big they were? I mean, are we talking about like huge ships where it has hundreds of people in it?
Yes, so an Ottoman war galley could have dozens of oars, banks of oars. They could have as many as 200 people on board in between the rowers and the other soldiers that were on board. In fact, when we say in English, a ship is heavily armed, it actually means how many arms there are on the ship, because people who were rowing could also be people who are fighting to defend the ship or to attack another ship. So if you were on a galley, many people were on a galley because they had been sentenced. And instead of going to jail, they were on the galley. In fact, in Italian, the word galera for jail comes from the word galley. That's how close the association is. There were people who were conscripted. There were parts of the Ottoman Empire where villages were periodically expected to find a certain number of young men who would serve for a certain number of time. And then there were people that were captured and were basically serving as slaves on board of ship. Of course, there were also people that were sort of professional mariners that had learned the trade from their families. But especially on a war galley, those people were probably in the minority.
But when we think of sailors, we always think that we always imagine the warships, right? Galleys and slaves and wars and battles and whatnot. But there were also merchants, right, and privateers, so to speak, who have been into this business. Though even on those ships, we know that there were guns because they needed to protect themselves. So if you think if you speculate on those privateers and private business and state-supported navy, can you say some more on those types of ships?
Again, there are many gradations. So there are merchant ships, and there's a technical difference between warships and merchant ships in the Mediterranean, in the sense that merchant ships tend to be sail-powered primarily, which means there's less really agonizing, brutal work to be done, which makes life a little bit more pleasant on board. So it was more likely that people on merchant ships were actually doing their work voluntarily. Then there are privateers in the sense of people who are kind of freelance military navies. So the Barbary Corsairs, for example, are a very good example of this. These are people who are running war galleys, but basically they're licensed by the Ottoman state to go out and attack and rob people and supplies from ships that are representing nations that are on poor terms with the Ottoman Empire. And the interesting thing is those people are the most cosmopolitan of anyone, because if you were to look at the composition of the crew of, let's say, a ship from Algeria in the 17th century, you would find people from Holland and Ireland and Italy and every place in the Ottoman Empire, and in some cases much farther beyond, sub-Saharan Africa. These were little tiny societies with representatives from almost everybody in the world.
Little universes.
Little universes, absolutely. And they traveled all over. There were Barbary Corsair attacks on Iceland in the 17th century. So, and they brought people back from Iceland who then became Corsairs and joined their crew.
And some of them went to New York. I know in the 17th century, some of them went to New York from
Yes, this was recently in the news. There was they found these coins, 17th century Ottoman coins in Connecticut that they speculate got there because there were some pirates. These are actually pirates, not Barbary Corsairs, who had cache of Ottoman coins that they brought with them and stashed in Connecticut.
So they were also one of the forces of they were like one of the globalizing powers, therefore. They were like transmitting knowledge from one continent to another, from one country to another.
Absolutely. This is a very important point, is ships are not only places where people from all over the world coalesce. They're also places where there's a lot of downtime. So when you're on a very crowded, isolated ship with nothing to do except talk, it's really an amazing opportunity to learn things from people that have completely different life experiences from you. And so it turns out the history of maritime life is extremely important for the history of the dissemination of knowledge and for the dissemination of technology, the developments of new technologies, and all kinds of related synergistic energy.
Yeah, not to mention all the drinking and partying and whatnot on the boards.
Also.
but at some point you said that life in galleys was like prison or hell-like prisons, but at the same time it seems that there was some attraction to that business too. Some people were attracted to that business. Was it?
Sure. I mean, so if you are a Corsair, you have the chance to become extremely rich. So there is it's a very dangerous job. It's a very risky job, but it's also a job that has, I don't know if any of our listeners have ever watched the show Deadliest Catch, which is about crab fishermen in Alaska. It gives you just a tiny sense of the danger and the difficulty, but also the possibilities of a life at sea. Those people on that show, they have extremely dangerous jobs. They're putting their life on the line every day. It's freezing cold, and yet they can earn tens of thousands of dollars in a week or two, which for somebody, especially somebody who's just a manual laborer, that would normally be completely impossible to even imagine.
All right. Then let's talk about the Ottoman Navy at large then. How big it was. As I said in my opening sentences, we most of the time assume that Ottoman Empire was mainly, land-based empire, and then they did not invest much in Navy or maritime expeditions. How big the Ottoman Navy was the Ottomans pay attention to the importance of Navy? Or another way of asking this question would be did the Ottoman Navy grew proportionately with the expansion of the empire? After all, we are talking about massive empire. So when we look at its naval power, was it also big and important, especially in comparison to its competitors?
Yes, so it's a very good question. The short answer is the Ottoman Navy is very big, but because the Ottoman Empire is so big, in comparison, it's not so big. So the Venetian Navy and the Ottoman Navy, more or less the same size in the 16th century. And the Venetian Navy is basically the largest navy in the Mediterranean. So the Ottomans and the Venetians have the two largest navies in the Mediterranean. Venice is a very small territorial state, though. So for them, the Navy was a much larger proportion of their state expenditures. It occupied a much larger amount of their attention and their resources than was the case for the Ottoman Empire. So it's one of those complicated questions. It's precisely because the Ottoman Empire is so big, every little individual part of it is receiving less attention. That would be the case in a much smaller kind of a state. I can tell you that, for instance, in one of the things that I spent a lot of time studying is this big Ottoman naval expedition to the Indian Ocean in 1538. Okay, in that case,
I will come to that, Giancarlo. I will come to
I just wanted to say that there were 10,000 people in that fleet. This is the largest fleet that had ever sailed in the Indian Ocean, as far as we know, up until probably the 19th century. And yet, it's in Ottoman chronicles, you won't even see any mention of it at all, because it just wasn't considered that important for them to discuss.
That's very interesting. And those things through Portuguese sources mainly. How did you come up with these numbers, or how did you come up again writing your own book on Ottoman naval power and its contribution to the world?
So in that particular case, there are the only really detailed Ottoman account of that expedition that survives is from Katib Çelebi, who's a historian from about 100 years later. So there aren't very many contemporary sources, but there are in fact many contemporary sources in European languages, including people who participated on the Ottoman side. Okay, so this is another very good example of how cosmopolitan maritime life is. So there is an account in Italian by a Venetian who was in the Ottoman fleet fighting for the Ottomans against the Portuguese. There's another account in Hungarian of a Hungarian who was on an Ottoman ship participating for the Ottomans in this fleet that sailed from Egypt to India to fight the Portuguese.
So from this, can we say safely say that we are still so far away from knowing all the intricate details of the history of Ottoman Navy? We don't know much enough, apparently.
Yes,
Don't know much now.
there's a lot more to learn. And part of the reason, Cengiz, is because if you want to really understand something like the Ottoman Navy, you have to do it through many different kinds of sources in many different languages.
Right.
To be honest, none of us, there aren't any historians who know all of the languages that you would need to know. So it's really something that we need to work collaboratively. And, you know, as historians, we're not very good at doing collaborative research. That's something that's changing, maybe slowly now.
Point.
But we have so much emphasis on individual scholar sitting by himself, reading documents, writing a monograph, and then, you know, impressing everybody else with how much she or he has discovered. That isn't really the best way to study something like this.
That's very true. I mean, we all of us, like, you know, cherish again interconnectedness and the importance of world history and whatnot. But when it comes to doing it, it takes the whole village, in a way, to complete such a good project. You are absolutely right in that. I'm gonna, like, you know, come to this question of, like, you know, Ottoman expeditions beyond the Mediterranean in a minute. But before that, I want to, like, still understand the structure of Ottoman Navy. We know that at the top we have this Kaptan-ı Derya, right? I mean, this chief commander. So can you tell us a bit, like, you know, how the Navy, Ottoman Navy, was structured? There was any, again, systematic way of doing things, or things were, like, you know, happening sporadically here and there?
I mean, in some ways, it's like almost everything in the Ottoman system. There's this constant tension between a centralizing impulse and then a pull towards decentralization. Right. So on the one hand, the Ottoman central government does want to keep control of everything. They want to have the Navy run from Galata, which is in Istanbul. They want to have a central arsenal. They want to be able to appoint the person who's the Kaptan-ı Derya. On the other hand, most of the innovations are going on in very distant places. And the only way that the Navy will work in the long run is if you can continually incorporate new people who have new kinds of experience and new familiarity with new places and new technologies. And so you can see that happening in the history of the Ottoman Navy. If you just look at who the different admirals, the Kaptan-ı Derya in the 16th century, there are people like Seydi Ali Reis, who is from an old family of people that have been working at the Galata arsenal for generations. Then there are people like Barbaros Hayreddin Pasha, who actually wasn't involved in the Ottoman state at all. He was a corsair who, along with his brother, had sort of conquered some territory in North Africa, became very powerful independently of the Ottoman state. And then he was sort of invited to come to Istanbul and be the head of the Navy. Or there was somebody like Kılıç Ali Pasha, who happens to be from the same part of southern Italy as my family, who was captured as a slave and then converted to Islam and then became a captain and then eventually rose up to becoming the Grand Admiral of the fleet. So there were all these different paths to advancing up the ranks of the Ottoman Navy.
Okay. Speaking of the Corsairs, I mean, in 2 weeks' time, we will be talking about Corsairs and, you know, pirates more specifically, to just, you know, tell it advance. So the Ottoman, again, interest and knowledge of the world. Now I'm curious about, I mean, another common assumption in the popular imagination was that, you know, Ottomans did not know much about the New World. Even if they knew little, they didn't, you know, develop an interest into it. On top of it, their, you know, war technology, like ship making, building technology was not, you know, good enough to build ships which could sail outside of Mediterranean. I'm just wondering, what is your take on this question? I mean, why, or more provocatively, I mean, why the Ottomans did not go to the New World?
Yes, it's one of the classic questions. And in Turkey, everybody always asks me this. It's always a kind of a melancholy question, right? Oh, if only we had gone to the New World, then, you know, people would be speaking Turkish instead of English in Wisconsin, and wouldn't that be nice? This is based on a really deep misunderstanding of the way maritime exploration works. So again, 16th century ships aren't like yachts from the 19th century. You can't just get on and go wherever you want. In the case of expeditions across the Atlantic, you know, if you're coming from the Ottoman Empire, you first have to leave the Mediterranean. Right. And it turns out that leaving the Mediterranean is incredibly difficult. First of all, the current at the Straits of Gibraltar, the current on the surface always flows from the Atlantic into the Mediterranean, and it's a very fast current. Second, the wind almost always blows from the west to the east. So the current and the winds are going the wrong direction. Normally, if you want to sail out from the Mediterranean, you have to wait. You can only do it at a couple of times during the year. You have to wait around for conditions to be just right, and then you can escape. Now, imagine you're first leaving from the Ottoman Empire, from Istanbul, let's say. It would take you 2 months to get across the Mediterranean to Spain. Then you have to wait around just off the coast of your most dangerous enemy. Spain is the Ottoman Empire's most dangerous enemy. Then, if they don't attack you when conditions are just right, then you make it into the Atlantic. Then you have to sail across the Atlantic, but you can only sail across the Atlantic at certain times of the year, and probably it won't be the right time of year.
Right.
It was impossible. It's impossible. That's why even the Spanish, when they send fleets to the New World, they don't send fleets from Barcelona. They send fleets from Sevilla. Why? Because Sevilla has a river that goes into the Atlantic directly, so that they don't have to sail from the Mediterranean. No state in the early modern period could have explored the New World from the Mediterranean. Impossibility. No matter what technology the Ottomans had or didn't have, it was never, ever a possibility.
But you are saying that, you know, it does not come down to the question of lack of technique or technology in shipbuilding. And after all, I mean, the Portuguese and the Spaniards at some point made it, right? They went to the New World, plus they came all the way down to south of Africa and then India. So if you compare this shipbuilding technology in the 16th and 17th century,
yes,
I mean, were they comparable? Or
so
not?
There is in fact a very important difference in shipbuilding technology, but it's directly related to the different geographical conditions that people are living in. So in the Mediterranean, so in the Atlantic, where the seas are extremely rough, already in the Middle Ages, people had developed this kind of ship which was very, very rigid hull, very strongly built with extremely high sides, because the Atlantic has gigantic waves. And so by the 15th century, those began to be developed into military vessels. That's a galleon, is a kind of a hull-sided sailing ship that has cannons on it. And those are the ships that people sailed across the Atlantic. But in the Mediterranean, I think a lot of people have the misconception that those are just better ships. But in the Mediterranean, those are not better ships because they're designed for the Atlantic. So in the Mediterranean, where you don't have such high waves, where you have more predictable winds, where you have a lot of islands and shallow water, a galley is militarily much more useful because you can go against the wind. It's very narrow and fast when there isn't any wind. You can use oar power. You can go into small bays. You can maneuver much better. And so we actually know that even in the case of the Spanish, who had fleets in the Mediterranean and in the Atlantic, all of their fleets in the Mediterranean used exactly the same kinds of ships as the Ottomans did. And it's because they knew that the ships that were designed for the Atlantic were not useful in the different conditions of the Mediterranean. And so it isn't really a question of not being able to build the kinds of ships that the Portuguese and Spanish built. It's really a question of where you are and using the technology that's adopted for that place.
I remember.
I can say in the Indian Ocean, we know that the Ottomans did experiment briefly with trying to build Portuguese-type tall-sided galleons. But in the end, what they learned is that by taking advantage of the monsoons and the special conditions of the Indian Ocean, they could actually adapt Mediterranean galleys to the Indian Ocean in a way that was, in fact, very effective. And you can see that over time, it's the Portuguese that start to emulate the Ottoman technique. So Portuguese start more and more to use galleys
Hmm.
in their encounters with the Ottomans during the course of the 16th century.
So that assumes that, I mean, both sides somehow knew each other or stealing technology from each other and whatnot, right? There was this knowledge on both sides, on each other.
Yes, and inevitably, precisely because there are so many people that are actually on one ship of one fleet, but previously were on another ship on the opposite fleet. There's this constant
Right.
flux of people back and forth.
That would actually take us to the question of captives, right? I mean, the captives were part of the whole deal, obviously. And as you said, I mean, they could, one person could be here this year and next year that could be other. I mean, can you just tell us about this slave world and how it works, and some examples from both sides?
So this is, I think, in my own classes on Ottoman history. I don't know about in your classes, but my students have the most difficult time believing that in the Ottoman Empire during the early modern period, there is actually a systematic way in which slavery is used to create the elite of the empire. It's so
Right.
different. The basic idea of what slavery is for is so different from what we expect it to be from a Western perspective that students just, they can't believe it. But the fact is, in the 16th century, almost every single governor, vizier,
Right.
admiral are technically slaves. These are people
Right.
that were enslaved either through the devshirme or they were captured. And then were sort of given the right incentives to embrace Islam, to become loyal to the Ottoman state, and then eventually to be the most powerful people in the empire. And the Navy is absolutely no exception to that. The Navy is actually one of the most important ways in which people are captured. Either sometimes people are captured as children at sea, sometimes they're captured as adults, sometimes even people volunteer to switch sides. I'm just finishing an article about somebody who voluntarily left Venice and came to the Ottoman Empire to be a technicalist consultant in the arsenal in Galata. But it's one of the keys to success is their ability to bring people against their will originally, and then over time to be able to convince them to actually become a part of the Ottoman system. And in the end, many of them become extremely loyal subjects of the empire. There's an amazing case from the Inquisition. It was studied by, there's a really interesting book called The Christians of Allah. The Christians of Allah.
That's good.
About the Inquisition files pertaining to people who had converted to Islam and then were captured on ships in the wrong direction, okay? And then the Inquisition would interrogate them. The problem is, if you were a Muslim from the beginning, that's one thing, then you'll just be a galley slave.
Right.
If they can prove that you were a Christian and you converted to Islam and then they caught you, then you get the death penalty, okay?
You're a bad Christian. You're a bad Christian.
So there's one guy, and he's a captain of a ship from Algeria. He's captured by a Sicilian fleet. Some of the other guys on the ship say, hey, this guy was originally a Christian. So the Inquisition takes him, they interrogate him. He says, no, my name is Hassan. I'm from, he says he's from Zonguldak or someplace like that, someplace in the Black Sea. He says, my mother was named Fatma, my father was named Hussein. I have nothing to do with Italy. But they interrogate people, Somebody says, I think he's from this town. They write a letter to the bishop of this town near Ferrara in northern Italy. They say, yes, there's some people, they say their relative went missing about 25 years ago. They bring his cousins down to Palermo and they confront him with these guys that say, yeah, this is our cousin. This whole time, the case lasts years. He's been speaking through an interpreter, speaking in Arabic or Turkish. Finally, when he's confronted with these relatives, his language becomes incoherent. he starts speaking in half in Italian and half in Arabic. And he finally says, "Don't you tell me who I am. So what if the man who squirted liquid into my mother was a Christian? That means nothing. It has nothing to do with who I am. I say I'm Hassan from Zonguldak, and I'm Hassan from Zonguldak." But it doesn't matter. He's dead. They kill him.
Yeah, I'm sorry for that guy. but you are talking most about male slaves. I mean, what about female slaves? Because Navy, yes, we may see more male slaves, but since sailors were also civil merchant ships too, where they're also raiding and capturing kids and females and whatnot. I mean, what are their story in this picture, in this big picture?
Well, certainly ships are predominantly male environments, but you have lots and lots of female passengers on board of ships, and you have lots and lots of examples of women who are taken prisoner, just like men, and who end up becoming Ottomans in much the same way that the men did. So in fact, many of the women, some of your viewers might have enjoyed the Magnificent Century, the Turkish soap opera about the 16th century.
Right.
People debated all kinds of things about the historical accuracy of that show, but one thing that it's very good at is showing how the women in the palace, including the Sultan's relatives, lovers, sister, mother, everyone, those are, again, all foreign slaves. Many of whom came exactly the same way, by being captured at sea. At
war or at sea. I mean, at land, on land or at sea. You are absolutely right.
Or sometimes there were raids. In Calabria, where my family is from, there are all these stories of the Turki coming and taking away the women. It turns out actually that many times the Turki, the Turks who were attacking the village, were actually people from the next village who had some sort of vendetta for some reason. They would become Muslims, join the Ottomans, and then tell the Ottomans, we have a village that we can help you to raid. And then the vendetta would continue. So these raids are actually completely connected with sometimes extremely local dynamics, rivalries between families. Maybe somebody who wanted to marry a girl didn't get permission, so he decided he would become an Ottoman and then steal her.
Absolutely. I know that in recent years you have been working on those slave narratives, and then your book is going to appear on one of those famous stories from the 17th or early 18th century. Can you tell us about that story, especially in the context of exchange of knowledge between the worlds? Because again, wars, they are horrible, but at the same time, wars in all times at sea or on land were means of transmission knowledge, exchange of knowledge between different civilizations. It was apparently one of the unintended consequences. But in that context, can you talk about your new hero?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So this is a fellow named Osman Aga of Timișoara. Timișoara is a city which is now in Western Romania, but obviously in the 17th century, it was right in the middle of the Ottoman Balkans. And as a young man, he was a soldier, and he was captured as a part of what they call in European history, the Great Turkish War between the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburg Empire after the Second Siege of Vienna. Nothing unusual about that. There were thousands of people like him that were taken prisoner. The interesting thing about him is that he eventually wrote a book about his life story. And it's actually the first book-length autobiography that was ever written in Ottoman Turkish. And he gives us the whole, starting from his childhood, but then 12 years that he spends as a captive in the Austrian Empire. First under extremely difficult conditions. He's in dungeons, he's tortured by a sadistic master, he almost dies of dysentery. But then he becomes the domestic servant of an extremely rich and powerful aristocratic family in Habsburg, Vienna. And in fact, surprisingly, you can see a very similar kind of process as the one that we know better from the Ottoman case. These aristocrats clearly wanted Osman to convert to Christianity. They wanted him to become their protege and to stay and sort of rise up the ranks of the Habsburg imperial system. But he escaped and made his way back to Ottoman territory. And later on, much later on, he wrote this book, which is really a fascinating book. It has all kinds of intimate details, also about his sexual escapades. And it has very, very deep and moving sections in which he really addresses this question about the fragility of personhood and whether it's actually ever possible to go back home after being through the kind of experience that he lived through of being a captive and sort of completely removed from his reference. When he goes home, he's been dreaming of returning home and the solidarity that he'll feel with his Muslim compatriots, and it turns out to be a sham. He can't find his way back in the way that he was hoping to. So it's a very interesting work of literature in addition to a historical.
Very much so. You know that was happening in the so-called era of Ottoman decline. I'm just wondering, like, when he was comparing the two worlds, the world of Habsburg and Central Europe, and then Ottoman Empire. I mean, how he was like comparing two worlds. I mean, was he a great admirer of, say, Europe and Europeans and their way of doing things, or he was kind of disinterested in that?
I mean, he doesn't discuss things abstractly in that way, at least not in this book. He wrote another book, History of the Holy Roman Empire, which I don't really know in depth in the same way that I know this book. But what he is interested in is precisely this question of who am I? You know, by the time he's writing his book, he's from Temeshwar. By that time, his hometown is part of the Habsburg Empire. It's not part of the Ottoman Empire anymore. And when he's trying to escape, he's in an extremely dangerous situation. He could be captured, he could be killed. He's sleeping, and he has a dream the night before his most dangerous leg of the journey. And he dreams that he's being hounded by dogs, and to get away, he climbs up the mountain of Karlowitz, and at the top of the mountain there's a palace. He goes into the palace, and his mistress, the wife of his owner, is there all alone, and she turns to him and she says, "Don't worry, Osman, I'm glad to see you too. Everything will be okay." And then he wakes up and he knows that he'll be safe. Wow, that's so strange. You know, he's escaping, and in that moment, the person that he imagines is watching over him to keep him safe is the person who enslaved him.
I see. Interesting. Okay, from the captive narratives, I want to take us back to the bigger question of that, again, Ottoman interest and discovery or non-discovery of the, New World. I remember from our, discussions over coffees or whatnot in old times, you were saying that one of the things that you were really trying to prove in your research to show that Ottomans did not necessarily interested in this, New World because they didn't felt a need to go out there because they were the ones who were capturing, controlling the most precious lands and things in the 16th, 17th, even 18th century. Are you still saying the same thing that Ottomans actually did not go outside because they didn't need to have, they did not feel to go out?
Well, I think very early on that is absolutely the case. Not only for the Ottomans, it's Christopher Columbus died insisting that he had not discovered a new continent. Why? Because he didn't want to have discovered a new continent. I mean, again, to my students, I explain it this way. Christopher Columbus is trying to sail to China because China in the 16th century, not so different from today, was the center of the world economy. Now, imagine, in that sense, imagine somebody like from an extremely poor place today, like let's say the Philippines. Okay? And their family invests all the money that they have to try to get them smuggled to New York. okay, which is the center of the world economy. They sit in a stinking dark container on a ship for a month. Dangerous, disgusting. They finally, after a month's voyage, see light as the doors of the container ship are opening up. And instead of New York, they're in Madagascar. How do you think that person would feel? They would be devastated.
Horrible.
Devastated. Well, that's exactly how Christopher Columbus felt when he sailed across the Atlantic trying to get to the center of the world economy at the time. And instead, he arrived in some place that nobody had ever heard about before. He didn't want to go to a place that nobody had ever heard about before. He wanted to find a way to get to the center of the world economy. So this is a very important part of the story that we shouldn't forget. Now, that only is true for the very first decades of the history of European exploration, after which the situation started to change quite quickly. And there, I think it is the case that I actually just recently wrote an article about this, that in the Ottoman Empire, for professional scholars, people like us, the question of the New World became a very fraught one, for political reasons, but also for intellectual reasons. You know, we as scholars are very invested in being able to say that we have mastery over knowledge in a way that other people don't. So if we were professors in the 16th century Ottoman Empire, we would have studied all kinds of things that are written in Arabic and Persian, and that would have sort of made us qualified to get our salaries at our university jobs. And none of those things said anything about the existence of a new world. So this was an extremely threatening reality. It actually called into question our credentials as scholars.
Right.
And so one of the things that you can see, and which I wrote about in this article that recently just came out, is that it's actually the sailors who are the ones that are much more ready and willing and able to acknowledge the new discoveries and then to sort of seriously think about what they mean in a much wider context about traditional authority and sovereignty and the idea that the Sultan is supposed to be universal sovereign, but he didn't even know about this other continent, and how you really can even know something. These are questions that people that are in the world of maritime life are talking about and writing about. Whereas people in the madrasa in Istanbul, not so much. It's very painful for them to even think about it.
Okay. All right. That makes sense. Again, it is hard to digest some of those, cruel realities, but yes, it makes sense. It makes sense. That brings me to like some of the popular questions. Again, there's another popular, somewhat like a romantic, nostalgic Turkish, opinion about Ottomans' relation to Mediterranean, and then one of the sentences goes like, at once Ottoman, like the Mediterranean was a Turkish lake. Was there any time that when the the Mediterranean was like a lake, like a Turkish lake?
No, there was not. The Black Sea, yes, the Black Sea was a Turkish lake. The Mediterranean was not. There was a time when they wanted it to be. So Piri Reis's Kitab-ı Bahriye, not his map of the New World, but his Kitab-ı Bahriye, was written in two versions. And the second version, which is a more embellished version, is absolutely written in part as a kind of an ideological showpiece to say, he says very clearly, usually geographers and mariners, when they think about the Mediterranean, they actually think about it as three different seas. There's the Black Sea, which is the same as for us, the White Sea, which is the Eastern Mediterranean for him, and then there's the Spanish Sea, which is the Western Mediterranean. But actually, these are all one sea, which is the Roman Sea, okay? And the idea being, he knows very well that for the Roman Empire of the past, the Mediterranean was the center around which the entire empire was built and by means of which it was connected. The Grand Vizier of the time, Ibrahim Pasha, is very invested in this idea that the Ottoman Empire is the new Rome and that they have a destiny to reconquer all of the territories that were once part of the Roman Empire. And so by making this geographical atlas, which shows the entirety of the Mediterranean Sea as one, and which is the Roman Sea, it's kind of intellectually setting the stage for this recreation of the Roman Empire in which the Mediterranean will become an Ottoman lake. So the aspiration is there, but the reality is never actually achieved.
But I mean, like by mid 16th century, is it not the case that in many of the major sea wars, one could see the Ottoman dominance over unified Christian fleets?
In the eastern half of the Mediterranean, yes, but in the western half, no. There's really kind of like you can draw a line down the middle, and the eastern half is Ottoman and the western half is not.
Or of a Levant, eastern Mediterranean was a lake or half of the lake.
Half of the lake,
Speaking of which, I mean, you already mentioned like competitors, contenders on the Mediterranean. So you mentioned Portuguese, Spaniards, and who else would be the other contenders and competitors in the Mediterranean?
Well, obviously it depends on the time. So in the 16th century, there's the Venetian fleet is very powerful, as I mentioned. The Maltese fleet is small but very important. The Pope has a small fleet. The other Italian city-states have they have their fleets. The French fleet, although the French fleet is usually allied or on friendly terms with the Ottomans. And then, of course, the Barbary corsairs, and Morocco has a very small but important fleet. Later on, you start to have a lot more Dutch, a lot more British presence. By the 18th century, you have Russians. Fleets are appearing in the Mediterranean relatively regularly. So it changes over time.
Okay. Then when we look at things like in a greater scale, was there any like unique Ottoman contribution to the naval history, technologically or strategically or whatnot? I mean, do you see anything unique Ottomans, or they were basically sharing the same things with everyone else in their own time?
There is very much a shared reality of maritime life. There are a few things that are certainly unique about the Ottomans. One is they have archers on their ships, and that's simply because Ottoman archers they have a monopoly on that particular kind of a technology. There isn't any European power that has access to good archers the same way that the Ottomans do, and that's something actually that they're relatively jealous of. They wish that they could reproduce that. Also, Ottoman galleys seem to have had much bigger, the main gun. So a galley is like a giant canoe, as I said. So unlike a tall-sided ship, you can't really have cannons that are pointing sideways. So you really just have, you can only have them long-wise. And the Ottomans had these enormous bow guns, just like ridiculously large and powerful bow guns. They seem to have been, in fact, larger and more powerful than others from that time.
Yeah, excellent.
In the Indian Ocean, you see that there's a lot of experimentation. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that there was a kind of hybrid ship that was a combination of an oar-powered and a tall-sided sailing ship that is not supposed to have been there. If you read basically any book of the history of naval technology, they'll tell you that's a galleass which didn't exist until the end, after the Battle of Lepanto, but I can even show you pictures from the 1530s, and they're definitely there.
Okay. So if I ask you, like, since we're coming to the end of our conversation, if I ask you, like, name me 3 of your most favorite, Ottoman sailors, who would they be? Your favorites?
Yes. So one would certainly be Seydi Ali Rais.
Your hero.
He wasn't necessarily that good of a sea captain, but he was an intellectual. This is why
I say
He was supposed to safely bring an Ottoman fleet around the Arabian Sea from Basra to Egypt, but instead he was caught in a storm and he was caught in a Portuguese ambush and he lost most of the ships and he ended up in India. But then he wrote an account of his travel back from India. He wrote an account of the technical aspects of naval navigation in the Indian Ocean and cartography. Also an astronomical treatise. He was trained as an astronomer. He was a very curious guy, and he was a real intellectual, somebody who was part of the life at sea, but at the same time, he had a formal madrasa education too. So he was able to kind of bring together those two different ways of studying and knowing. A second one would be somebody named Francesco Giustiniani. He was the Venetian that I mentioned who voluntarily came to work for the Ottomans, never converted to Islam. He had formerly been in Portuguese Asia and learned about the Portuguese ocean-going vessels. And then he decided that he wanted to try to convince some other power to give him money to build his own fleet and take over the Portuguese colonies in India from them. So he came back. First, he went to France and he said to the King of France, "Give me money. I'll build some galleons and I'll sail to Portugal, sail to India and become your viceroy of India." Didn't work. Then he went to Venice, made the same offer. Didn't work. Then he went to Istanbul and he made the same offer. And he never was able to do that, but he did, in the end, actually go to India in 1538 as a part of this expedition that left from Egypt.
An amazing character. Wow.
The third is the one that I mentioned before, Kılıç Ali Pasha, who was from the same place in Italy as my family. And the reason why I'm particularly grateful to him is that my mother was very against the idea of me going and studying in Turkey. Because she had heard all of these stories about the Turks are people that they attacked our
barbars.
Coast, they raided our towns, they raped our women. You can't go there; it's too dangerous. Then, when she came to visit me in Istanbul when I was a student, I took her to the mosque of Kılıç Ali Pasha, and I explained, "Look, this is a guy from Calabria. He was captured. He became a Muslim. He was actually the commander of the only part of the Ottoman fleet at the Battle of Lepanto that was not destroyed. And then he became Grand Admiral and he was given the job of rebuilding the Ottoman fleet, for which he brought all of his friends from childhood in Calabria to Istanbul to work in the arsenal. And the neighborhood behind the arsenal was called Küçük Calabria at that time, Little Calabria. And in fact, his mosque is built in that same neighborhood. And that's also today where the Italian high school is and the Italian hospital was and all of that. At which point my mother was extremely proud and said, "You see, we Calabresi, we always succeed no matter what kind of adversity we face." And ever since then, she was always happy when I went to Istanbul. So if it hadn't been for Kılıç Ali Pasha, it would have been much more difficult for me.
Great, I totally understand that. Okay, my last question, and then I am going to entertain some of the questions asked by our audience in last 5-6 minutes. Okay, the time when Ottomans felt a need to change things in the Navy because they were losing grounds and wars to these bloody Europeans and Russians. So at what point they just started to change things by way of quote unquote modernizing their army? If you say a few things about that, and then we'll move to the next, because the topic is, I know, extremely huge.
Yeah. So I think that it starts, you can see that people starting to acknowledge this with this guy that I mentioned, Katip Çelebi, who writes this book. I mean, he's a very famous author. He writes about all kinds of different topics, but one of the first things that he wrote about actually was the history of the maritime wars of the Turks, of the Ottomans. He wrote it in the midst of the Ottoman siege of Hania, in other words, the island of Crete that was a Venetian colony, and that they expected to be able to conquer very easily. And in the end, it took them more than 20 years. So he was sort of writing this history book to try to understand intellectually why Ottoman fleets of the past had been so successful and why now they seem not to have been. Now, the interesting thing is that he is usually thought of as somebody who was an innovator and breaking with tradition. But in that book, he is completely a traditionalist. It's one of the early stages in his intellectual development. He says, the reason that we're failing is that we're not using the same kinds of ships that we were in the 16th century. We're not organizing the fleet in the same way that we were in the 16th century. Actually proposing to go back. But then that's sort of the obvious that's the first step to acknowledging that you have a problem. It's sort of like Alcoholics Anonymous. The first step is acknowledging that you have a problem. And then people start from there. So it's really the 18th century, and that's not even something that I'm necessarily an expert on.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. I have few questions here. One was about simply thanking you for speaking about Kılıç Ali Pasha. I don't know. Maybe Robert Benedettino probably also has some connection to him
maybe his mother also was impressed.
And the question is here about like an Ottoman military activity. After thanking you, Richard Fisher is asking, in most accounts of Ottoman military activity from Malta to Gallipoli, the naval forces seem, one, to lose very often, and two, act with extreme cruelty toward opponents and those defeated or captured. What do you say about this dimension of Ottoman wartime behavior, especially when it comes to the exercise of and motivations for wartime power?
Right. So again, it depends when you're talking about. There's a very long time between Malta and Gallipoli. But let's take, for example, the Battle of Lepanto. Almost any book of European history or world history or naval history or the history of technology or the history of the military revolution or anything, you'll read it and it will tell you that the Battle of Lepanto was a crushing defeat for the Ottomans and that it turned the tide. And after the Battle of Lepanto, Ottoman sea power was destroyed, and it marks the beginning of the rise of European advanced naval power. If you told something like that to somebody in the year 1573 in the Ottoman Empire, I mean, they would have been stunned, because within 2 years of the Battle of Lepanto, the Ottomans conquered Cyprus, and the point of the Battle of Lepanto was to defend Cyprus. They conquered Tunisia from Spain, and they actually built another fleet that was even bigger than the fleet that was destroyed at the Battle. So it's an important example of the way that the narrative that we have in our heads that the Ottomans are always losing isn't really reflecting the actual story so much as a kind of, in fact, it's a 19th century Enlightenment history of the triumph of the Western Enlightenment, in fact. In terms of the cruelty, naval warfare is cruel. There's no way to get around that. It's absolutely cruel. Whether the Ottomans were more cruel, I really doubt it. And one of the things is to take into consideration is precisely this question of how slaves are treated as possible recruits for career advancement, which is profoundly different from the case in contemporary European fleets in the Mediterranean. If you are captured at sea by the Knights of Malta, by Naples, by Spain, you will spend your life as a galley slave until you die, unless somebody ransoms you. You have to be very rich and powerful for that to happen. There's absolutely no chance of you converting to Christianity, getting a good job, and then eventually becoming prime minister of the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. Never, ever going to happen in a million years. You will be a slave, you'll die a slave. When you die, they will throw your body to the dogs. That's it. To me, that's cruel. And that isn't, in fact, the Ottoman system. So any time you talk about comparative cruelty, it's a very subjective discussion, but that would be something that I think would necessarily be part of that kind of a conversation.
Yeah, the shared reality is hitting there hard, us as well. Okay, thank you very, very much, Giancarlo. Thanks for being with us, and thanks all the participants, audience, for being and staying with us until the end. I think some of the major takeaway points from today's rich discussion with Giancarlo was that, after all, Ottoman Navy was not that bad. I mean, they could easily compete with their competitors in the 16th, 17th, even until the 18th century. They apparently also partook in the expeditions in the time of explorations. They were also aware of what was happening in the world, Indian Ocean and Atlantic Ocean. And slaves were interesting mediums of exchange of ideas and technologies on both sides. And there is apparently maybe a small, but there is a room for the slaves in the Ottoman context to have some advancement in their social mobility. And I think these are some of the major takeaway points. And then Giancarlo provided us many other food for thought. And I would like to again thank him one more time, and thanks to everybody one more time. And I wish you a great, healthy, happy days.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Cengiz. It was a pleasure.
I hope to see you again. Bye-bye.